November 13, 1942, so on 48 hours. The destroyer Amatsukaze moved through Iron Bottom Sound. On the bridge, Commander Tameichi Hara held the railing tightly as star shells lit the sky, exposing his ship in blinding white light. For 20 years, the Imperial Japanese Navy had trained to dominate the night. But now American shells were already landing dangerously close before his lookouts could even see where the fire was coming from. From the bridge windows, Hara saw something that challenged everything the Japanese Navy believed. American ships were striking with perfect accuracy at over 10,000 yards in complete darkness. There were no searchlights giving them away, no star shells marking their targets. The cruiser USS Helena was using radar to guide its gunners, and when Hara left his own searchlights burning too long in an attempt to identify the attackers, Helena's 6-inch shells tore through Amatsukaze, killing 43 of his men, just 3 kilometers away. The battleship Hiei was being hammered by precise fire from enemies her lookouts couldn't even detect. A ship that had fought at Pearl Harbor, once a symbol of Japan's naval pride, was now being torn apart by opponents who were fighting from beyond visual range. What Hara and other Japanese officers didn't realize was that they were facing a new technology, the SG Surface Search Radar. In only 18 months, this device would erase Japan's greatest tactical strength, its dominance of night warfare. The defeat wasn't measured in ships sunk or ground lost. It was in the sudden collapse of 20 years of strategy, doctrine, and training based on one belief, that the Imperial Navy owned the night. The roots of this belief stretched back to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. At the Battle of Tsushima, Admiral Togo's torpedo boats had crushed the Russian fleet under cover of darkness. That triumph became the foundation of Japanese naval doctrine. Night combat was the key to defeating larger enemies. By 1942, Japan had developed the most advanced night fighting system in the world. Japanese sailors spent endless hours drilling in darkness. Lookouts went through rigorous programs to sharpen their night vision, sitting in dark rooms for hours, avoiding vitamin A deficiencies, and practicing distance estimation in low light. The result was remarkable. A Japanese lookout could detect a ship silhouette at 7,000 kilometers on a moonless night, twice the range of his American counterpart. Technology supported this confidence. While early American radar was weak and often ignored by commanders, Japanese optics were the best in the world. Binoculars made by Nippon Kogaku, later known as Nikon, provided unmatched magnification and clarity. Japan's Type 93. Long-lance torpedoes could reach targets at 24,000 Darwin, a range where American ships at night couldn't even locate them. Early battles in the Pacific seemed to confirm this superiority. On August 9, 1942, at the Battle of Savo Island, Japanese cruisers destroyed 4 Allied heavy cruisers in just 33 minutes without losing a single ship. On November 30, 1942, at the Battle of Tassafaronga, one Japanese destroyer squadron devastated a stronger American cruiser force, crippling 4 ships with torpedoes in minutes. What the Japanese did not know was that in American shipyards and laboratories a revolution was unfolding. The SG Surface Search Radar, developed by the MIT Radiation Laboratory and the Naval Research Laboratory, was far beyond the crude sets that had failed at Savo Island. Operating on a 10 centimeter wavelength with a 50 kilohour output, it could detect a destroyer at 15 nautical miles and track it precisely enough for accurate blind firing at 10 millimetering. This breakthrough was made possible by the British Tizard mission, which brought the cavity magnetron to the U.S. in September 1940. Historian James Finney Baxter III called it the most valuable cargo ever brought to our shores. Thanks to this device, the MIT Radiation Laboratory expanded rapidly, reaching nearly 4,000 workers by 1943 and producing about 1,000 SG radar sets during the war. The first Fletcher-class destroyer, USS Fletcher DD-445, commissioned on June 30, 1942, carried this radar as standard equipment. By November, Fletcher herself was already operating in the Solomon Islands, though she was the only Fletcher-class destroyer at the naval battle of Guadalcanal. The SG radar's plan position indicator, PPI scope, gave operators a sweeping top-down view of the battlefield. Every contact showed up on a circular screen that refreshed every 2 seconds. Operators could tell ship types apart, track torpedo wakes, and even detect submarines running just below the surface. It worked just as well in daylight or darkness, in clear skies or storms, smoke or fog. Linked to the Mark 37 gun director and an analog fire control computer, the system could produce firing solutions in seconds, accounting for target course, speed, wind, and ship movement. The Fletcher-class destroyer's 5-inch 38 caliber guns, firing 15 to 20 rounds per minute, became deadly when paired with this level of precision. The night of November 12-13, 1942 marked the turning point. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan's task force intercepted Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe's force heading for Henderson Field. Only USS Fletcher represented the new class, but several U.S. ships, including USS Helena, carried the SG radar. At 01:24 hours, Helena detected Japanese ships at 27,000 yards, long before they could be seen. For 20 minutes, American operators tracked the enemy in total darkness, while Japanese lookouts strained their eyes in vain. When the battle began, American radar-guided fire disrupted Japanese formations before they could launch their carefully trained night tactics. The destroyer Akatsuki tried a torpedo attack but was caught in radar crossfire and sank within minutes. Commander Hara's Amatsukaze still managed to hit USS Barton with torpedoes, breaking her in two, and crippled USS Juno. But when Hara switched on his searchlights to target USS San Francisco, Helena's radar-directed guns immediately locked on, ripping through Amatsukaze with heavy damage and high casualties. The battleship Hii, Admiral Abe's flagship, became the main target of American radar fire. In rain squalls and darkness that should have hidden her, she absorbed 85 shell hits from unseen attackers. Her bridge was destroyed, steering disabled, and her superstructure engulfed in flames. She was scuttled the next day, the first Japanese battleship lost in the war. From late 1942 into 1943, the imbalance between American and Japanese night fighting only grew. The SG radar, working at 3 GHz with 50 kW peak power, could detect destroyers at 15 plus nautical miles with range accuracy of plus to 40 YD and bearing accuracy of plus 0.5 degree. It weighed just 1,000 lbs and worked 95% of the time, making it reliable and widespread. The Japanese answer, the Type 22 radar, was far weaker. Operating at 150 MHz with only 2 kW power, it could spot a destroyer at 10 nautical miles under the best conditions, but with accuracy of plus to 300 YD in range and plus 10.5 degrees in bearing. It weighed 2,200 lbs, broke down often, and had only about 40% operational reliability. The result was clear. In just 18 months, American radar had stripped away the Japanese Navy's most trusted advantage. The nation that had mastered the night since Tsushima suddenly faced an enemy that could see in total darkness and fight with machine-like precision. Of the first 60 Japanese Type 22 radar sets built, only about 6 actually worked. By the end of the war, Japan had managed to build roughly 300 radar units total, less than 1/3 of US SG radar production alone. This gap was not just about numbers, but about deeper flaws inside Japan's military system. Japan had actually created cavity magnetrons by 1937, and Dr. Hidetsugu Yagi had invented the directional Yagi antenna back in 1926. Yet military leaders shut him out of radar development. Ironically, when Japanese troops captured British radar gear that included Yagi antennas, they did not realize it was based on a Japanese invention. Army and Navy rivalry further crippled progress, with each service building its own incompatible designs instead of cooperating. By late 1943, American radar's superiority was reshaping naval battles. At the Battle of Vella on October 6-7, 1943, the destroyer USS Selfridge tracked Japanese long-lance torpedoes by radar, allowing evasive maneuvers that would have been impossible earlier in the war. Fletcher-class destroyers now had more than detection. They had total tactical dominance. The famous Tokyo Express destroyer runs to resupply Guadalcanal had relied on Japanese night fighting skill. Crews led by elite officers like Captain Reizo Tanaka carried out these missions at high speed and with great discipline. But as U.S. radar spread across the fleet, even the finest Japanese destroyer captains began suffering heavier losses. Tanaka himself admitted the shift in his 1956 U.S. Naval Institute article, Japan's Losing Struggle for Guadalcanal, where he wrote about the growing radar advantage of the Americans. Despite his earlier success at Tassafaronga, he recognized that darkness no longer provided cover against radar-directed fire. By early 1943, American destroyers were ambushing Tokyo Express runs in total darkness, through rain and squalls, striking first and striking accurately. They could even chase fleeing Japanese ships at full speed, guided entirely by radar. On November 25, 1943, the balance tipped completely. Off Cape St. George, Captain Arleigh Burke led 5 destroyers against 5 Japanese destroyers. In a battle fought entirely by radar, Burke's force sank Onami, Makanami, and Ugiri without serious losses of their own. Japanese ships never even saw their attackers. This was the final surface battle in the Solomons, closing the book on Japanese night fighting superiority. By mid-1943, Japanese commanders were scrambling for answers. The death of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto in April removed perhaps the only leader who truly understood the danger of U.S. technological advances. Attempts to counter American radar failed. Japan deployed crude countermeasures such as aluminum foil strips called gimenshi, meant to confuse radar, but these had little effect on the advanced SG sets. With resources stretched thin and the services still divided, Japanese radar remained years behind. Commander Tameichi Hara, who survived the war as the only destroyer captain from Pearl Harbor to the end, later wrote in his memoir Japanese Destroyer Captain that officers came to accept their night fighting expertise was obsolete. While his book contained some factual mistakes, he was correct in recognizing American technology had erased Japan's greatest edge. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay on November 2, 1943, showed this most clearly. Rear Admiral Aaron Merrill's Task Force 39, including several Fletcher-class destroyers with the newest SG modifications, intercepted a larger Japanese force led by Rear Admiral Sentaro Omori. At 02:27 hours, American radar spotted the enemy at 35,900 yards, giving them a complete picture of the battlefield. For hours, U.S. ships tracked the Japanese flawlessly, maneuvering into ideal firing positions while staying invisible to enemy lookouts. The Japanese thought they were facing a supernatural force. American destroyers opened fire at over 14,000 yards in pitch-black conditions, scoring early hits. They even detected long lance torpedoes by tracking their wakes on radar, dodging them, and then counterattacking the launching ships without ever needing visual contact. The result stunned Japanese command. Omori's force, despite having more ships and heavier guns, was routed. The light cruiser Sendai and the destroyer Hatsukaze were lost, while the Americans suffered little damage. Historian Samuel Eliot Morrison later wrote that this battle marked the end of Japan's night combat advantage. The psychological blow was enormous. Crews who had spent their careers perfecting night combat now saw their skills made useless. Morale collapsed as sailors realized their long-lance torpedoes, once feared as unstoppable, were now wasted against radar-guided enemy maneuvers. Japan's best destroyer captains admitted they were fighting blind. Meanwhile, U.S. production was overwhelming. Between 1942 and 1944, American shipyards launched 175 Fletcher-class destroyers, more than the total number of destroyers Japan built in the entire war. Every one of these ships carried radar far ahead of anything the Japanese possessed. SG radar sets rolled off assembly lines at Western Electric, Westinghouse, and General Electric, powered by magnetron tubes that Japan could not mass produce. By 1945, the U.S. had built over 100,000 radar sets of all types, and radar kept getting better. The SG system was upgraded multiple times during the war, each version improving range, accuracy, and detail. By 1944, U.S. destroyers could spot a surface submarine at 18 mi and even detect a periscope at 3 mi. Japanese development stagnated. By August 1943, Japan's Naval Electrical Research Department had only 300 staff, compared to 4,000 at MIT's Radiation Laboratory. Material shortages and the lack of a large electronics industry made progress impossible. With radar eliminating the value of traditional night tactics, the Imperial Navy tried to adapt. New orders from Fleet Command openly admitted U.S. superiority and called for desperate maneuvering and acceptance of higher casualties. This was a total reversal from earlier doctrine. The Navy that once sought decisive night battles now did everything it could to avoid them. When the Japanese Navy was forced into battle, they often accepted severe losses if it meant getting close enough for a torpedo strike. Their training program struggled to adjust as conditions changed. At the torpedo school in Yokosuka, instructors experimented with blind launch techniques, firing spreads of torpedoes at calculated enemy positions without ever seeing the target. Results were poor. At the Naval War College, new doctrines were written that openly accepted catastrophic casualties as the price of night combat. Even Japan's submarine force, at first less vulnerable to American radar, soon ran into the same wall. Submarines relied on surfacing at night to recharge their batteries and travel at 15 knots. But SG radar stripped that advantage away. American destroyers could now detect a surface submarine from more than 15 miles away, far beyond visual range even in daylight. Forced to travel submerged, Japanese submarines slowed to 3 knots with batteries that lasted only hours, not days. Their effectiveness collapsed. In May 1944, USS England proved just how deadly this new technology had become. In just 12 days, she sank 6 Japanese submarines, all found first on radar. By the end of 1944, Japan's submarine losses had reached disastrous levels. Japanese officers compared their helplessness against radar to the frustration of fighter pilots watching B-29 bombers overhead. Just as the bombers cruised at altitudes Japan's planes couldn't reach, American destroyers attacked unseen from beyond visual range. It didn't matter how skilled or brave a crew was. Technology had made their training useless. The Battle of Vella Gulf in October 1944 confirmed this. It was the largest naval battle in history, and radar made it a mismatch. At Samar on October 25th, the destroyer USS Johnston under Commander Ernest Evans fought Japanese battleships using radar fire in rain and smoke. Outnumbered and outgunned, the American destroyers coordinated attacks through smoke screens that blinded Japanese optical rangefinders. Japanese gunners tried to track shells using colored dyes in their bursts, white for Yamato, pink for Nagato, yellow-green for Haruna, red for Kongo. But without radar, this method was crude compared to the Americans' automatic radar fire control. At Surigao Strait, U.S. destroyers attacked unseen. They launched torpedoes guided only by radar, and the battleship Fuso was sunk by ships her crew never even sighted. Japanese forces entered the strait in small groups and were wiped out by radar-directed fire. The shift had already been clear a year earlier. At the Battle of Vella Gulf, August 6 to 7, 1943, Commander Frederick Moosbrugger led 6 destroyers that detected 4 Japanese destroyers carrying 950 troops at 11:33 p.m. Using radar, the Americans closed to perfect torpedo range without being spotted. The attack was devastating. 3 Japanese destroyers, Hagakaze, Arashi, Kawakaze, were sunk and 210 sailors and troops killed. The Americans took 0 losses, not even a hit. Captain Tameichi Hara, commander of the lone survivor Shigur, later called it a perfect American victory. Admiral Chester Nimitz praised it as a little classic of naval warfare, proof that radar had erased Japan's night combat edge. On November 25, 1943, radar dominance was shown again at Cape St. George. Captain Arleigh Burke's Destroyer Squadron 23, the Little Beavers, tracked 5 Japanese destroyers with radar. They attacked at night without being detected. 3 Japanese ships, Onami, Makinami, Yugiri, were sunk. 647 men killed. The Americans suffered 0 casualties and no damage. Burke's report was blunt. Entire engagement conducted by radar plot. Visual contact with enemy never achieved nor required. After this, Japanese leaders accepted that night surface combat was impossible against radar-equipped forces. Cape St. George marked the final surface battle of the Solomon Islands campaign, ending Japan's night warfare strategy. Behind this change was America's overwhelming industrial power. Between 1942 and 1944, the U.S. built 175 Fletcher-class destroyers, produced about 1,000 SG radar sets, over 100,000 radar units of all types, 250,000 cavity magnetrons, 5 million radio tubes every month by 1944, and trained 50,000 radar technicians. Investment in radar reached $1.5 billion in 1940s dollars. Japan, by comparison, built just 32 destroyers of all types in the same years. Total radar production was around 300 sets of all kinds. Their factories produced about 50,000 radio tubes monthly at peak, with only about 500 radar technicians, most partially trained. The gap in resources and production was more than 50 to 1. America had more SG radar sets on its destroyers than Japan produced for every purpose combined. Each Fletcher-class ship represented industrial capacity Japan could not match for decades. Japanese training infrastructure, 20 years of night vision schools, lookout programs, and optical fire control systems, was wiped out in months. Their radar sets, like the Type 22, were unreliable and limited. It could only display a simple A-scope spike showing range, without the SG's PPI display that gave a full map-like view of the sea. It couldn't separate close targets or guide accurate gunfire. In every way that mattered, Japanese doctrine and equipment had been outclassed. The radar age had arrived and Japan's mastery of night combat was gone forever. Training on Japan's unreliable radar sets often backfired. Officers who experienced repeated failures came to distrust the equipment and reverted to visual spotting, even though it was far less effective. The waters around Guadalcanal, later called Iron Bottom Sound because of the many ships sunk there, became the proving ground for radar warfare. The shift was clear in Japanese losses during night battles. In August and September 1942, Japanese losses were nearly equal to American losses. By October and November 1942, Japanese losses were double. Between December 1942 and January 1943, their losses were triple. From February 1943 onward, Japanese losses became catastrophic while American losses dropped to minimal. By the end of the Guadalcanal campaign, Japan had lost 40 destroyers in just 16 months. According to U.S. Naval Institute records, Japan's long-standing edge in night fighting had completely collapsed. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, deeply tied to samurai traditions and the belief in personal combat excellence, radar warfare was a cultural disaster. The idea that machines could replace warrior skill contradicted their military philosophy. Young officers raised on stories of samurai valor struggled to understand a kind of battle where the enemy was invisible and untouchable. The radar gap also undermined racial theories that painted Americans as weak and dependent on machines, rather than courage. Japan tried to find countermeasures, but the results showed both creativity and futility. Aluminum chaff, known as window, failed against advanced U.S. radar. Electronic jamming never worked, as Japan lacked the electronics industry to produce it in useful amounts. Experiments with radar reflective paints gave only minor benefits. By mid-1944, Japan's Naval Technical Department had stopped trying to match American radar. Instead, Japan turned to kamikaze attacks. On October 19, 1944, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi formed the first official kamikaze unit at Mabalakat Airfield. His reasoning was clear. With only 40 operational aircraft and poorly trained pilots, conventional tactics could not succeed. The decision came from pilot shortages, poor training, loss of air superiority, and lack of resources. Radar was not mentioned in Japanese documents as a cause. The first organized kamikaze strikes came on October 25, 1944, coinciding with the Battle of Samar. But desperation, not radar, drove the tactic. Destroyer combat statistics showed radar's impact in sharp numbers. Before radar, from December 1941 to October 1942, Japanese destroyer losses in night combat were 8, while U.S. destroyer losses were 11. The ratio favored Japan at 1:4-1. In the early radar era, November 1942 to June 1943, Japan lost 19 destroyers while the U.S. lost 7. Now the ratio was 2:7-1 in America's favor. In the mature radar era, July 1943 to August 1945, Japan lost 47 destroyers in night combat while the U.S. lost only 4. The ratio had widened to 11, 8-1. The technical gap was overwhelming. The American SG radar worked at 3 GHz 10 cm wavelength with 50 kDotter power, detecting destroyers at over 15 nautical miles. Its range accuracy was plus or minus 40 yards, bearing accuracy plus or minus 0.5 degrees, and it used a modern PPI, planned position indicator display. Around 1,000 units were built. In contrast, Japan's Type 22 radar worked at 150 mm, 2-meter wavelength, with only 2 kDotter power. Its effective range against destroyers was about 10 nautical miles. Accuracy was poor, plus or minus 300 yards in range and plus or minus 5 degrees in bearing. It used only an A-scope display, a simple line showing spikes for targets. Only about 300 units were produced. The difference amounted to entire generations of technology. U.S. systems used magnetron tubes that Japan could not manufacture reliably and tied radar into automated fire control systems, something Japan never developed. Captured Japanese equipment and post-war interrogations revealed the depth of the gap. Japan had even captured British cavity magnetrons early in the war but could not copy them. When they captured radar sets with Yagi antennas, they did not realize these were named after Japanese scientist Hatsusaburo Yagi, whom their own military had sidelined. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey interviewed Japanese officers after the war, and all agreed that radar had changed naval combat in ways Japan could not adapt to. By 1943, senior officers understood the gap but kept it quiet to avoid destroying morale. The Battle of Cape St. George on November 25, 1943, symbolized the end of Japanese night fighting dominance. Captain Arleigh Burke's destroyer Squadron 23 used radar to achieve a flawless victory, sinking 3 Japanese destroyers without losses. After this, Japan's high command essentially abandoned night surface actions, conceding the advantage fully to America. Behind this revolution was the MIT Radiation Laboratory, founded in November 1940 under Dr. Lee DeBridge. It grew to nearly 4,000 staff and created about half of all radar systems used by U.S. forces. Its output went far beyond the SG radar, producing more than 100 microwave radar designs worth $1.5 billion in 1940s dollars. This research gave the U.S. Navy a decisive edge that Japan never came close to matching. The turning point in naval warfare began with the British invention of the cavity magnetron, delivered to the United States during the Tizard mission in September 1940. This single device, producing 1 kilowatt at a 10-centimeter wavelength, was 100 times more powerful than anything available at the time. The Americans quickly mass-produced what Britain had created, while Japan was unable to reproduce it. From this breakthrough, 9 scientists at the Radiation Laboratory later went on to win Nobel Prizes, but their greatest wartime achievement was sparking the electronic revolution that changed naval combat forever. Battles were no longer decided by eyesight but by radar. This radar revolution forced navies to completely rethink how they fought. By 1947, a U.S. Naval War College study had concluded that future battles would be determined by electronic capability rather than seamanship. In the 1950s, Japan's new maritime self-defense force built its foundation on these lessons, recognizing that electronic detection was the key to naval power. Technical officers in Japan who understood radar's implications during the war were ignored by commanders clinging to outdated tactics. The small group of officers trained in electronics predicted defeat, but their warnings went unheeded. While the U.S. fully integrated radar into its fleet, Japanese commanders still relied on visual night attacks, even as their ships were destroyed from beyond visible range. The results spoke for themselves. Radar flipped the balance of power. The Japanese night fighting advantage, perfected since the early 1900s, was wiped out by American radar. At the start of the war, Japan had 70 modern destroyers. By the end, only about a dozen remained. Radar had turned the night into America's battlefield. One of the most important voices from the Japanese side was Commander Tameichi Hara, the only destroyer captain from Pearl Harbor to survive the entire war. In 1961, he published his memoir, Japanese Destroyer Captain. Although it contained some errors, it remains the most detailed first-hand Japanese account of the radar war. Hara fought in 16 major naval battles, witnessing the transformation of warfare. His ship Amatsukaze survived the brutal night action of November 13, 1942, despite severe damage from radar-guided gunfire from the USS Helena. He later commanded the cruiser Yahagi and the destroyer Shigure, surviving encounters where many of his fellow captains did not. In his memoir, Hara criticized Japanese leaders for failing to grasp the speed at which the Americans could innovate, and for refusing to accept the reality of technological change. He lived to see Japan's night-fighting supremacy completely overturned. Admiral Raizo Tanaka, famous for leading the Tokyo Express supply runs, also admitted the scale of the defeat. In a 1956 article for the U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings titled, "Japan's Losing Struggle for Guadalcanal," he openly acknowledged that radar had made Japanese night tactics obsolete. The Bushido belief that spirit and courage could overcome material disadvantages was destroyed by magnetrons and oscilloscopes. After the war, Japan had to reconcile its warrior traditions with the reality that technology would dominate future battlefields. The lesson was absolute. In modern war, those who can detect the enemy first will always win. The combat statistics confirm the revolution. Japanese destroyer losses in surface battles were devastating. 1942, Novdek, 4. Destroyers lost 1943, 31. Destroyers lost 1944, 28. Destroyers lost 1945. To Aog, 14 destroyers lost. In comparison, American destroyer losses in night surface combat were far fewer. 1942. Novdek, 3 destroyers lost 1943, 4. Destroyers lost 1944, 1 destroyer lost 1945, 0. Destroyers lost by 1944. The difference was overwhelming. The U.S. Navy had 175 destroyers with fully operational radar, while Japan had none. American radar had a 200-300% range advantage, and Japan's famed night vision was rendered completely useless. This was one of the fastest and most complete technological shifts in military history. The Fletcher-class destroyers fitted with SG radar erased Japan's advantage in less than 2 years. Skills and tactics that had been refined since the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 were suddenly irrelevant. Technology had stripped them of their mastery. Commander Hara's survival through 16 battles gave him unique perspective. From his first encounter with radar at Guadalcanal to his final command of Shigeru, the sole survivor at the Battle of Vella Gulf, he saw firsthand how radar changed everything. Japan had entered the war believing that superior training and skill in night combat could offset America's industrial power. By the end, radar had proven that technology could completely overturn tradition, experience, and courage. The Fletcher-class destroyers didn't just defeat Japan's destroyer fleet. They changed the very nature of naval combat, from art to science, from human skill to electronic supremacy. The Japanese officers who lived through it knew the truth. The age of visual combat ended at Guadalcanal. Radar had taken over, and courage alone could not match its power. What Japan once ruled became their graveyard. In just 18 months, radar had made the United States the undisputed master of the night. The revolution was total, final, and irreversible. Those who could see won. Those who clung to the old ways were left blind in the darkness they once dominated.